The leather strap bit into Elizabeth's wrists as they bound her to the weathered post, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. The stolen vial of medicine, Kale's only hope, lay shattered in the dirt beside her feet, its precious contents seeping into the earth like spilled blood. Behind her, she could hear the crowd gathering, their whispers sharp as winter wind through the narrow alleys of Philadelphia's forgotten districts. She had known this moment would come. The theft had been clumsy, born of desperation rather than skill, but watching her 8-year-old brother waste away in their cramped tenement room had stripped away any pretense of caution. Cale's fever had burned for weeks now, his small frame growing thinner with each passing day, and the medicine she'd glimpsed behind the apothecary's locked cabinet had seemed like salvation itself. Now, as the crowd pressed closer and the Volkov clan's brutal foreman Garrick stepped forward with his practiced sneer, she wondered if her sacrifice would mean anything at all. Elizabeth Carter. Garrick's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. You stand accused of theft from the protected merchants of this district. The penalty is 3 lashes, administered publicly, as decreed by ancient law. His pale eyes glinted with something that went beyond duty, a hunger that made her stomach turn. The Volkov clan had ruled these streets for decades, their supernatural strength ensuring compliance through fear, and Garrick had built his reputation on making examples of those who dared challenge their authority. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with all the defiance she could muster. I stole medicine for my dying brother. I regret nothing. The words came out stronger than she felt, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Some faces showed pity, others curiosity, but most displayed the careful blankness of people who had learned that witnessing too much could make you the next target. Garrick's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the flickering lamplight. Your noble intentions change nothing. The law applies to all mortals equally. He gestured to one of his subordinates, who stepped forward carrying a leather whip, its braided length dark with old stains. 3 lashes for theft. Let this serve as a reminder to any who would forget their place in the natural order. The first strike landed across her shoulders with the force of a lightning bolt, tearing through her thin shawl and into the flesh beneath. Elizabeth bit down hard on her tongue to keep from crying out, tasting copper as blood filled her mouth. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, not just the sharp agony of torn skin, but a deep, radiating fire that seemed to consume her entire being. Through the haze of torment, she could hear Cale's labored breathing in her memory, and she held on to that sound like an anchor. The second lash fell lower, across her ribs, and this time she couldn't contain the sharp gasp that escaped her lips. The crowd had grown silent, their earlier murmurs fading to nothing as they watched her ordeal. She could feel warm blood trickling down her back, soaking into the remains of her clothing, but she forced herself to remain upright. Whatever happened to her, she would not give Garrick the satisfaction of seeing her break. But as he raised the whip for the third strike, something shifted in the air around them. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and even the torchlight appeared to dim. A presence moved through the crowd, not walking so much as flowing, with a grace that spoke of power held carefully in check. Elizabeth couldn't turn to see who approached, but she felt the weight of ancient eyes upon her, measuring and evaluating in ways that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. Enough. The word carried absolute authority, spoken in a voice like aged whiskey and midnight thunder. Garrick's arm froze mid-swing, the whip trembling in his suddenly uncertain grip. Step away from the girl. Elizabeth had heard whispers of the Prince of the Three Realms, Damian Blackthorne, but had never imagined she would encounter him in the flesh. He moved into her limited field of vision, and she understood immediately why mortals spoke his name in hushed tones. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the surrounding light, he commanded attention simply by existing. His amber eyes held the weight of centuries, and when they fixed on Garrick, the foreman actually took a step backward. Prince Blackthorne, Garrick managed, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. This is clan business. The girl stole from our protected merchants. The punishment is prescribed by law. Damian's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, taking in her bloodied back and the determined set of her jaw despite her obvious agony. Something flickered in those ancient eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or simply interest. What did she steal? Medicine, Garrick replied, his voice growing smaller. Expensive medicine for some sick relative. The merchant demands satisfaction. And you would kill her for it? The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Elizabeth could see the tension coiling through Damian's frame, a predator preparing to strike. Look at her, Garrick. Look closely. Against her will, Elizabeth found herself studying the vampire prince's face, searching for some clue to his intentions. He had saved her from the third lash, but his motives remained as mysterious as shadow itself. Power radiated from him in waves, not just physical strength, but something deeper and more dangerous. This was a creature who had shaped the hidden world according to his will for longer than she had been alive. I see a thief, Garrick said, but his voice lacked conviction. A mortal who forgot her place. You see nothing. Damian's words carried the finality of a death sentence. In one fluid motion, he crossed the space between them, his hand closing around Garrick's throat. The foreman's feet left the ground, his struggles growing weaker as those amber eyes blazed with cold fire. She is under my protection now. Anyone who harms what is mine answers to me personally. The crack of Garrick's neck breaking echoed through the suddenly silent square like a gunshot. Damian released the body, letting it crumple to the cobblestones, then turned his attention back to Elizabeth. With surprising gentleness, he began working at the ropes that bound her wrists, his touch careful despite the obvious strength in his hands. Can you stand? His voice had lost its earlier edge, becoming something softer and infinitely more complex. Elizabeth nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. Her back felt like it was on fire, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each drop of blood that fell to the ground. My brother, she whispered, the words barely audible. He's dying. The medicine will be provided. Damian cut her off, his hand steadying her as she swayed on her feet. You and the boy are under my protection now. My property, by right of salvage. He gestured to one of the figures that had emerged from the shadows. His own people, Elizabeth realized, called by some signal she hadn't noticed. Bring the child, and summon a healer. As strong arms lifted her carefully from the post, Elizabeth tried to process what had just happened. In the space of minutes, she had gone from facing death to being claimed by one of the most powerful beings in the supernatural world. The crowd was already dispersing, eager to distance themselves from the violence they had witnessed, leaving only Garrick's cooling corpse as evidence of the prince's intervention. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it, her voice weak but determined. Why save me? Damian's amber eyes met hers as his subordinate carried her toward a waiting carriage that seemed to have materialized from the very darkness itself. For a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his ancient features. Perhaps because you were willing to die for someone you love, or perhaps because I recognized something in you that spoke to purposes beyond your understanding. Time will reveal which truth holds more weight. The carriage door opened, revealing an interior of dark leather and polished wood that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension. As they settled her carefully on the cushioned seat, Elizabeth caught sight of another figure being helped into the vehicle, pale but alert, his fever-bright eyes wide with wonder and confusion. Relief flooded through her so completely that she nearly wept. Whatever else happened, her brother was safe. Damian settled across from them, his presence filling the confined space like smoke given form. You will serve in my household, he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. Your skills as a scribe will be put to better use than they have been in these streets. In return, you and your brother will have shelter, sustenance, and protection that extends beyond anything the mortal world could offer. As the carriage began to move, rolling through streets that grew progressively stranger and more shadowed, Elizabeth realized that her old life was ending as surely as if she had died at that post. She was no longer just a desperate thief. She was now the property of the Prince of Shadows. But as the carriage rolled toward his dark domain, she had to wonder if she had just exchanged one cage for another. The Gothic spires of Blackthorne Manor pierced the perpetual twilight like accusatory fingers, their shadows falling across Elizabeth as she stood in the vast library that would become her domain. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the square. 3 weeks of tentative healing and careful observation. Her back still bore the marks of Garrick's whip, though the supernatural physician Damian had summoned had ensured they would fade to mere whispers of silver across her skin. More profound was the change in her circumstances, from desperate thief to keeper of centuries' worth of ancestral records, each tome and scroll holding secrets that could reshape the balance of power in the supernatural world. Cale had recovered with the swift resilience of childhood, the medicine Damian procured working its miracle in mere days. Now her brother spent his time in the manor's gardens under the watchful eye of Mrs. Thorne, the ancient housekeeper whose loyalty to the Blackthorne line stretched back generations. Elizabeth could see him through the tall windows, chasing phantom butterflies that materialized from shadow and light. Creatures of Damian's making, designed to delight a mortal child in a realm where such innocence was rare as sunlight. The genealogical records of the House of Mordain require immediate attention. Damian's voice cut through her reverie, drawing her back to the present moment. He stood in the doorway like a figure carved from midnight itself, his amber eyes reflecting the candlelight that illuminated the endless rows of books. Their bloodline claims date back 6 centuries, but I suspect deliberate falsification in the 3rd generation. Elizabeth nodded, her fingers already moving toward the indicated section. In the weeks since her arrival, she had discovered an unexpected talent for parsing the intricate relationships and hidden connections that bound the supernatural families together. What had begun as simple record-keeping had evolved into something far more complex. She was becoming Damian's eyes and ears into the labyrinthine politics that governed his world. The Mordain crest changed twice in the 14th century, she replied, pulling a leather-bound volume from its resting place. Once after the Great Plague, then again following the Treaty of Shadows. Both. Changes suggest legitimacy, challenges that were resolved through means other than law. A ghost of a smile touched Damian's lips. Your perception continues to surprise me, Elizabeth. Yes, the Mordains eliminated their rivals through strategic assassinations, then altered their records to support their claims. But proving such ancient deceptions requires evidence that most would not think to seek. He moved closer, close enough that she could catch the subtle scent that clung to him. Something like winter air and old parchment, with an underlying note of power that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Over these weeks, their interactions had developed a rhythm that felt both professional and intensely personal. He would present her with puzzles that challenged every aspect of her intelligence, and she would unravel them with a skill that seemed to genuinely impress him. But underneath their scholarly collaboration lay currents of tension and attraction that neither dared acknowledge openly. The council meets tomorrow night, Damian continued, his voice carrying a weight that made Elizabeth look up from the ancient text. Representatives from all the major houses will be present, including some who would prefer to see the Blackthorne influence diminished. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the manor's perpetual coolness. You believe they mean you harm? I believe they mean to test the boundaries of my power, he replied, moving to stand beside the great hearth where flames danced without consuming their fuel. There are those who whisper that I have grown too attached to mortal concerns, that my protection of you and your brother represents weakness rather than strength. The words hung between them like an unsheathed blade. Elizabeth set down the genealogy carefully, her mind racing through the implications. Then perhaps I should not attend. My presence would only provide them with ammunition for their accusations. Damian's laugh was low and dangerous. On the contrary, your presence will demonstrate exactly why their whispers are born of ignorance rather than insight. He turned to face her fully, and in his amber eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. You will accompany me tomorrow night, Elizabeth, not as my property, but as my blood scribe, a position that grants you certain protections and privileges within supernatural law. The title sent a shiver through her that she couldn't entirely explain. Blood scribe was more than just a designation. It was a bond that connected her fate irrevocably to his. What does that mean exactly? It means, Damian said, crossing the space between them with fluid grace, that you are no longer simply under my protection. You are part of my power structure, essential to my operations in ways that transcend mere service. He stopped just close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. It also means that any who would harm, you must first consider whether they are prepared to face the full wrath of the Prince of the Three Realms. Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but not from fear. The intensity of his gaze, the barely contained power that radiated from his frame, the way he spoke of her as though she were precious rather than merely useful. It all combined to create a sensation she had never experienced in her previous life of desperate survival. And what do you require of a blood scribe? Truth, he replied without hesitation. Complete honesty, even when it challenges my assumptions or threatens my comfort. The ability to see patterns that others miss, to understand the connections that bind our world together. He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his features, and loyalty that extends beyond duty into something deeper. The confession landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful professional distance they had maintained. Elizabeth felt the weight of centuries in his gaze, the loneliness of a creature who had outlived countless companions and learned to guard his heart against further loss. Yet here he stood, offering her not just protection, but partnership, not just safety, but significance in ways that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. You have my loyalty, she said softly, the words carrying more weight than any oath sworn before altar or throne. And my truth, whatever the cost. Something shifted in Damian's expression, a fortress wall cracking to reveal the man beneath the prince. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Elizabeth thought he might close the remaining distance between them, might finally acknowledge the attraction that had been building like storm clouds on the horizon. But instead, he stepped back, reasserting the careful boundaries that governed their relationship. The council convenes at midnight, he said, his voice once again controlled and distant. Dress appropriately. You represent the Blackthorne house now, and our enemies will be watching for any sign of weakness or impropriety. The next evening found Elizabeth standing before a mirror in chambers that dwarfed her former tenement room, adjusting the midnight blue gown that Mrs. Thorne had selected from what seemed to be an endless wardrobe of formal attire. The dress was beautiful, but intimidating, silk that whispered with every movement, cut to emphasize her figure while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her new position. A silver pendant bearing the Blackthorne crest hung at her throat, marking her as belonging to one of the most powerful houses in the supernatural hierarchy. Cale had been settled for the evening with a collection of books that would keep him occupied until her return, though Elizabeth suspected he would be asleep long before the council session concluded. Mrs. Thorne had assured her that the manor's protections extended throughout the grounds. No harm could come to her brother while he remained within Damian's domain. You look every inch the blood scribe. Damian's voice came from the doorway, and Elizabeth turned to find him transformed as completely as she was. Gone was the casual elegance of his daily attire, replaced by formal robes that seemed to capture and hold the shadows themselves. The effect was magnificent and terrifying, marking him as a creature of power that transcended mortal understanding. I feel like I'm wearing a costume, Elizabeth admitted, smoothing the silk with nervous fingers. What if they see through the pretense? What if they recognize me for what I am? Just a thief from the Philadelphia slums who got lucky? Damian crossed the room with fluid grace, stopping close enough to adjust the silver pendant at her throat. His touch was brief but electric, sending warmth racing through her veins. You are Elizabeth Carter, blood scribe to the Prince of the Three Realms, keeper of ancestral records and diviner of hidden truths. Your origins matter far less than what you have become. The council chambers occupied the heart of an ancient building that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Elizabeth could feel the weight of centuries pressing down upon her as they entered the vast circular room. Representatives from dozens of supernatural houses sat in tiered seating that rose like an amphitheater, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility, as Damian led her to the seats reserved for the Blackthorne delegation. The Mordanes were present, as expected, their pale features sharp with aristocratic disdain. The Ravencroft clan occupied a section to their left, their leader's scarred face speaking of battles fought and won in service to their ambition. But it was the delegation from the House of Ashford that drew Elizabeth's most careful attention. 3 figures in elaborate masks that concealed their identities, while radiating an aura of barely contained menace. Prince Blackthorne, the council speaker called, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. You have requested recognition of a new blood scribe. Present your candidate for evaluation. Damian rose with fluid grace, his hand briefly touching Elizabeth's shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. I present Elizabeth Carter, formerly of Philadelphia's mortal districts, now proven worthy through deed and dedication to serve as keeper of the Blackthorne ancestral records. A murmur ran through the assembled representatives, some surprised, others openly skeptical. Elizabeth felt the weight of hundreds of ancient eyes upon her, measuring and judging in ways that made her skin crawl. But she kept her chin raised and her expression calm, drawing strength from Damian's steady presence beside her. A mortal blood scribe. Lord Mordane's voice dripped with disdain. How unprecedented. What qualifications could such a creature possibly possess? She has unraveled genealogical deceptions that have stood unchallenged for centuries, Damian replied, his tone carrying subtle challenge, including several that touch upon the legitimacy claims of houses represented in this very chamber. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Elizabeth realized that Damian was not merely defending her appointment. He was using it as a weapon, a demonstration of his power to see through the carefully constructed lies that form the foundation of supernatural society. By making her his blood scribe, he was announcing his intention to reshape the political landscape according to truth rather than tradition. Interesting? One of the masked Ashford representatives spoke for the first time, their voice carrying an accent Elizabeth couldn't place. And what does this mortal think she has discovered about our ancient bloodlines? The question was clearly a trap, designed to either embarrass Elizabeth with ignorance or provoke conflict through unwelcome revelations. But as she looked out over the assembled faces, she saw not enemies, but puzzles waiting to be solved, patterns begging to be recognized. The week spent studying genealogical records had given her insights that even some of the houses themselves might not possess. I think, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, that truth has a way of surfacing, regardless of how deeply it has been buried. and I think that those who have built their power on lies should perhaps consider whether they are prepared for a world where deception no longer provides protection. The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Several representatives exchanged glances that spoke of plans being rapidly reconsidered. But before anyone could respond, Damian rose to his full height, power radiating from him in waves that made the very air seem to thicken. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "Elizabeth Carter is my blood scribe, granted all the protections and privileges that position entails. She is essential to the Blackthorne operations and irreplaceable in ways that extend far beyond her professional capabilities." His amber eyes swept the chamber, meeting each gaze with unflinching intensity. "She is mine, and I protect what is mine with every resource at my disposal." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled council. This was more than mere appointment to office. It was a public claiming that elevated Elizabeth's status beyond anything Immortal had achieved in living memory. Several representatives actually drew back in their seats, recognizing the implicit threat in Damian's words. But Elizabeth barely heard the murmurs of surprise and calculation that followed. Her attention was entirely focused on the man beside her, the vampire prince who had just declared before the most powerful beings in the supernatural world that she belonged to him in ways that transcended mere service. The intensity of his gaze when it met hers spoke of feelings that had been carefully hidden beneath professional courtesy and protective distance. "The appointment is recognized," the speaker announced after a lengthy pause filled with whispered conferences. "Elizabeth Carter is confirmed as blood scribe to the House of Blackthorne, with all associated rights and responsibilities." As they left the council chambers, Elizabeth felt fundamentally changed by what had transpired. The careful boundaries that had governed her relationship with Damian had been publicly shattered, replaced by something infinitely more complex and dangerous. She was no longer simply a servant granted protection. She was his, claimed before the assembled powers of the supernatural world in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The carriage ride back to the manor passed in charged silence, both of them acutely aware of the words that had been spoken and their implications. When they finally reached Blackthorne Manor, Damian escorted her to the library where their professional relationship had first taken root. But now the familiar space felt different, charged with possibilities that had been acknowledged if not yet fully explored. "You handled yourself admirably tonight," Damian said, pouring himself a measure of something dark and potent from a crystal decanter. "The council will think twice before challenging Blackthorne interests in the future." Elizabeth moved to the great windows that overlooked the gardens where Kale played in daylight hours. "Is that why you did it? To send a message to your political rivals?" "Partly," he admitted, setting down his glass to approach her. "But not entirely." She turned to face him, her heart hammering as she recognized the vulnerability in his ancient eyes. "Then why?" "Because," Damian said softly, "somewhere between watching you decipher century-old deceptions and seeing you risk everything for your brother's life, I realized that my feelings for you had grown beyond anything resembling professional interest." The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Elizabeth felt the weight of lifetimes in his gaze, the loneliness of a creature who had learned to guard his heart against the inevitable pain of loving mortals who would age and die while he remained unchanged. Yet here he stood, offering her his truth despite the risk it represented. "I know what I am," she whispered, stepping closer. "Mortal, fragile, temporary in ways that make this impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Damian replied, reaching up to cup her face with hands that could reshape reality but touched her with infinite gentleness. "There are ways, Elizabeth, choices that could be made, if you were willing to consider them." The implication sent electricity racing through her veins. the choice between mortality and eternity, between the life she had always known and something beyond her wildest imaginings. But as she looked into his amber eyes, she saw not just desire, but something deeper, a connection that transcended the boundaries between human and supernatural, mortal and eternal. "I would need time," she said finally. "Time to consider what such a choice would mean, not just for me, but for Kale." "Time you shall have," Damian promised, though she could see the hunger in his gaze, the barely contained need that made his voice rough with want. "But know this, Elizabeth. What was declared tonight cannot be undone. You are mine now, in every way that matters." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the otherworldly warmth that radiated from his frame, could see the flecks of gold that danced in his amber eyes. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she thought he might kiss her, might finally close the distance that had been maintained between them since that first night in the square. Instead, he pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than any passionate embrace. "Sleep well, my blood scribe. Tomorrow brings new challenges, and I find myself curious to see how you will meet them." As he left her alone in the library, Elizabeth sank into one of the leather chairs, her mind reeling from everything that had transpired. The council's recognition, Damian's public declaration, the admission of feelings that had been carefully hidden beneath professional courtesy, it all combined to create a reality that seemed impossible and inevitable in equal measure. Through the tall windows she could see the first hints of dawn touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Soon Cale would wake, eager to share whatever adventures his dreams had brought. But Elizabeth knew that their quiet life at Blackthorne Manor was about to change in ways that would test every assumption about love, loyalty, and the prices one was willing to pay for both. The words hung in the air, a confession and a promise. Their connection was no longer a secret, but an undeniable truth. But in a world of ancient hatreds, a truth like that wasn't a comfort. It was a target. The attack came at dusk 3 days later, swift and merciless as winter wind through bare trees. Elizabeth had been in the library, cataloging a collection of pre-Reformation manuscripts when the ancient wards surrounding Blackthorne Manor screamed their warning. The sound was beyond hearing, a vibration that struck directly into the soul, setting every supernatural sense ablaze with danger. She dropped the illuminated psalter she'd been examining, its priceless pages scattering across the Persian carpet as the manor's lights flickered and died. Through the tall windows she could see figures moving across the grounds. Too many to count, their forms wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour the moonlight itself. The Ashford clan had come calling, and they had brought allies. "Cale!" The name tore from her throat as she ran toward the nursery wing, her silk gown hampering her movements. Behind her, she could hear the sound of splintering wood as the manor's doors gave way, beneath supernatural assault. Mrs. Thorne's voice echoed through the corridors, shouting orders to servants who had protected the Blackthorne line for generations. She found her brother huddled beneath his bed, his small hands pressed over his ears as the sounds of battle raged closer. "Lizzie?" His voice was small and frightened, so different from the confident boy who had been chasing shadow butterflies just hours before. "It's going to be all right," she whispered, pulling him into her arms with hands that shook despite her attempts at calm. "We're going to hide until Damian comes home." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they might be lies. The vampire prince was attending to business in the city's financial district, a meeting that had been arranged weeks in advance, but now seemed suspiciously convenient for their enemies. The nursery door exploded inward, revealing 3 figures in the distinctive masks of House Ashford. Their leader stepped forward, his blade gleaming with substances that made Elizabeth's skin crawl just looking at them. Elizabeth Carter. His voice was cultured and cold. The mortal who would play at being supernatural nobility. She pushed Cale behind her, her body becoming a shield between her brother and the creatures who had come to destroy everything Damian had built. What do you want? To send a message. The leader replied, advancing with predatory grace. The prince of the three realms has grown too fond of mortal attachments. We simply mean to remind him of why such feelings are inadvisable. Elizabeth's mind raced through possibilities, each more hopeless than the last. The manor's protections had been breached, the household guard overwhelmed. Mrs. Thorne's commands had fallen silent, suggesting the worst. But as despair threatened to paralyze her, she remembered Damian's words from the council chamber. She is mine, and I protect what is mine with every resource at my disposal. He'll come for me, she said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. And when he does, he'll find only ashes and regret. The Ashford assassin interrupted. His blade swept forward in an arc designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. They wanted her alive long enough to feel her death, wanted Damian to arrive in time to witness her final moments. The weapon caught her across the ribs, its poisoned edge burning like liquid fire as it opened her flesh. Elizabeth gasped, stumbling backward as warmth spread across her silk gown. Behind her, Cale's cry of terror seemed to come from very far away. The poison on the blade was already working, making her vision blur and her limbs grow heavy. She collapsed to her knees, one hand pressed against the wound that was bleeding far too much, far too quickly. The assassin stood over her with professional satisfaction, waiting for the inevitable. But Elizabeth found herself thinking not of death, but of the choice Damian had offered her in the library just days before. There are ways, Elizabeth. Choices that could be made, if you were willing to consider them. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as her heartbeat slowed. She could feel her life ebbing away, could see Cale's face growing pale as he realized what was happening. The boy who had been her entire world, the reason she had stolen medicine and endured the lash, was about to watch his sister die as helplessly as she had once watched him waste away with fever. Then the air itself seemed to tear, and Damian materialized in the nursery doorway like vengeance given form. His amber eyes blazed with fury that made the very shadows recoil, and power radiated from him in waves that sent the Ashford assassin stumbling backward. He took in the scene with a single glance, Elizabeth bleeding out on the carpet, Cale huddled and terrified, enemies who had dared violate his sanctuary. The slaughter was swift and terrible. Ancient strength met modern treachery, and treachery was found wanting. Elizabeth watched through dimming vision as Damian moved like death itself, his hands becoming weapons that rendered armor meaningless. The assassin's screams were brief and final, their carefully laid plans dissolving into nothing more substantial than morning mist. When silence finally returned to the nursery, Damian knelt beside Elizabeth's prone form, his hands hovering over her wound with desperate precision. How long ago? His voice was raw with emotion she had never heard from him before. Minutes, she whispered, the words taking enormous effort. The blade, poisoned. His face went white as marble. Ashford venom. It's designed specifically to kill mortals slowly enough for... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. His hands were shaking as he lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest. Elizabeth, listen to me. The poison will kill you within the hour. But there's another way. She knew what he was offering even before he spoke the words. The choice he had mentioned in the library. The possibility that had hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Immortality. Transformation. An eternity bound to his darkness in exchange for continued existence. Cale, she managed, her gaze finding her brother's terrified face. What happens to him? He stays, Damian promised immediately. Protected, cared for, given every opportunity to live the mortal life you wanted for him. But Elizabeth... His voice broke slightly. I cannot make this choice for you. The transformation must be freely given, or it will fail. And once begun, it cannot be stopped or reversed. Elizabeth felt the poison spreading through her veins like ice water, stealing warmth and strength with each labored heartbeat. Death was approaching with inexorable certainty, but beside her knelt a creature who could offer her escape from that fate. Not just survival, but transformation into something powerful enough to protect the people she loved. She thought of the weeks spent in his library, unraveling mysteries that spanned centuries, of the way he had declared her his before the assembled council, claiming her with words that had rewritten the fundamental nature of their relationship, of the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his ancient power, the loneliness that had shaped him across lifetimes of loss. Will it hurt? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Yes, he answered honestly, but not more than this, and not forever. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the last of her mortal strength ebbing away like tide retreating from shore. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady despite the pain that racked her frame. Then do it. The words seemed to release something fundamental in Damian's carefully controlled nature. He shifted position, supporting her more fully as his other hand moved to cup her face. Elizabeth, he said softly, once this is done, you will be mine in ways that transcend every bond you have ever known. Forever bound to darkness, forever changed from what you were. Are you certain? I'm certain, she replied, using the last of her mortal voice to speak the truth that had been growing in her heart since that first night in the square. I love you, Damian. Whatever I become, that won't change. Something broke in his amber eyes, centuries of careful control shattered by words he had never expected to hear from mortal lips. And I love you, he whispered, the confession carrying the weight of lifetimes. More than I believed possible, more than wisdom would advise. He lowered his head to her throat, his lips finding the pulse that was growing fainter with each passing moment. Elizabeth felt his fangs pierce her skin, not the brutal tearing she had expected, but something almost gentle, like being claimed by shadows that promised safety rather than destruction. The pain of the venom began to fade, replaced by a cold burning that seemed to originate from her very bones. Look at me, Damian commanded, his voice rough with effort and emotion. Stay with me through this. Elizabeth met his gaze as the transformation began in earnest, her mortal vision sharpening until she could see details that had been previously invisible, the flecks of ancient gold in his amber eyes, the way power moved beneath his pale skin like captured lightning. The cold fire spread outward from her heart, reshaping everything it touched according to patterns older than human civilization. Her last mortal breath caught in her throat as her heart stuttered and stopped. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she existed in a space between life and death, between human and supernatural. She could feel Damian's presence, like an anchor, holding her steady as her very essence was rewritten according to his nature. Then her heart began again, but differently, slower, stronger, powered by something beyond mere blood. Elizabeth gasped, her enhanced senses immediately overwhelmed by the richness of the world around her. She could hear Cale's heartbeat from across the room, could smell the lingering traces of fear and violence that clung to the air, could feel the ancient power that flowed through Damian's frame like a river seeking the sea. How do you feel? His voice was soft with wonder and relief. Elizabeth sat up slowly, marveling at the strength that filled her limbs. The wound across her ribs had already healed, leaving only a thin line of silver to mark where mortal vulnerability had ended. Different, she said, her voice carrying new depths and harmonics. Like I've been sleeping my entire life, and only now awakened. She looked toward Cale, who was staring at them both with wide eyes, and felt a pang of something that might have been loss. She could still love her brother, still feel the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to theft and sacrifice, but the nature of that love had changed. She was no longer the desperate mortal sister who would risk everything for his welfare. She was now something infinitely more capable of ensuring his safety. Will he be afraid of me? The question carried centuries of potential sorrow. Perhaps, at first, Damian admitted, helping her to stand on legs that felt both familiar and completely new. But children are remarkably adaptable. Give him time to understand what you've become, and why you chose it. Elizabeth approached her brother slowly, kneeling so that they were at eye level. Cale's face was pale but curious rather than terrified. Apparently, the complete transformation was less frightening than watching her die had been. Lizzie, his voice was uncertain. Are you different now? Yes, she said simply, reaching out to touch his cheek with fingers that would never again know the weakness of mortality. I'm different, but I'm still your sister, and I still love you more than anything else in this world or any other. Cale studied her face with the directness that only children possessed. You look the same, he decided finally. Just more. Elizabeth laughed, a sound that carried new music in its harmonics. More is exactly right. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that her enhanced vision rendered in spectacular detail, Elizabeth stood at the nursery window with Damian's arm around her waist. The Ashford assassins had been dealt with, their bodies removed by servants who asked no questions and offered no judgments. Mrs. Thorne had survived the attack, though she bore wounds that would take time to heal. The manor's protections were already being reinforced, ensuring that such a breach could never occur again. What happens now? Elizabeth asked, leaning into the solid warmth of Damian's frame. Now we rebuild, he replied, his lips brushing against her temple. The council will need to be informed of your transformation, and there will be political consequences to navigate. But Elizabeth... He turned her to face him, his amber eyes blazing with emotions that no longer needed to be hidden. We have eternity to figure out the details. She rose on her toes to kiss him, her lips meeting his with a passion that had been building since that first night in the square. The kiss was fire and shadow, mortality surrendered and immortality claimed, two souls recognizing their perfect complement in each other. When they finally broke apart, Elizabeth felt complete in ways she had never imagined possible. I love you, she whispered against his lips, the words carrying the weight of forever. And I love you, he replied, his voice rough with centuries of longing finally fulfilled. My blood scribe, my partner, my eternal companion. As the sun climbed higher, casting its light through windows that no longer held any threat for her, Elizabeth realized that her story had not ended with transformation. It had truly begun. She was no longer the desperate mortal who had stolen medicine for her dying brother, no longer the frightened woman who had faced the lash with nothing but stubborn courage to sustain her. She was Elizabeth Blackthorne now, keeper of ancient secrets and guardian of supernatural law, bound by love to a creature whose power could reshape the world according to his will. But more than that, she was home in ways that transcended any mortal understanding of the word. The desperate scribe who had once faced death for love had chosen love over death, and in doing so, had found not just survival, but transformation into something magnificent and eternal. As Damian's arms tightened around her and Cale's laughter echoed from the gardens below, Elizabeth knew that every sacrifice had been worth this moment, this perfect beginning of forever.